Hello everyone, and welcome to the next edition of the webinar series organized by the Ball State's Center for Professional Selling. We have Darby Fazekas, who is a Senior Vice President of Business Development at the Devine Group. She has worked with a lot of big companies, helping them with their needs in terms of business development, making sure that they have the right kind of employees out there. And she's actually helped develop a lot of rainmakers for many organizations as well. Darby is actually a contributor to our sales program, and she's kindly consented today to come and share some of her insights about what she's seen about how big organizations go about doing business development and what are some of the trends, especially when dealing with younger millennials, which of course there's a lot of consensus, a lot of questions about what is the right way of looking at millennials, but we just decided anybody 35 and under. So Darby, thank you once again for taking your time to come out on this day where it's snowing out there. Thanks again for being out here.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
You're welcome. You forgot something really important though.
Which is?
Ball State grad.
Ball State grad.
Yes.
So there you go.
Yes.
So essentially, well, one of the things that we've seen, the previous speaker is actually also a Ball State grad, and I'm always amazed at the fact that how much there is the willingness to come back and share insights and stuff like that. And not only are you a Ball State grad, but you're encouraging your kids.
That's right.
To actually come out to Ball State as well. And I think thank you once again for the trust you place in us. But again, Darby, I actually want to take this time to actually talk to you about this concept of business development. Let me, even before we delve into millennials, what does business development mean to you? Because I've heard so many things about people talk about business development. Business development could be, hey, it could just be a fancy word for sales.
Right.
I have to go bring in sales. Or it could be, I want to develop a market. We have a new product. We want to take a look at the new markets and how we do that. So according to you, what is business development?
Well, so inside and outside our company, it may be different.
Yeah.
And as you said, when it comes to the title of business development, sometimes that's just fancy for sales because there are certain organizations that they don't really like to consider that they have salespeople, and a lot of times that is, you know, for accountants or attorneys, those types of professional fields. So they call it business development. In our organization and in a lot of other organizations, what they do is they divide sales into two categories. There's direct sales, which is how that company sells to a direct buyer, direct organization, and then there is reseller or channel sales or some sort of indirect. And so that's what I do with the Devine Group. I work with our channel sales and our reselling partners and independent resellers around the world. Not by myself. I have teams that help with that. And so we sell through our resellers rather than selling directly to a client.
Fantastic. So which means that business development for you could be actually finding those resellers who could go out there and sell. Because that's one of the things that I always get. I've had people who are product managers who come in and say, hey, we've come up with a new concept, and then we actually need to do business development that is actually finding a market. Of course, the next step would be then going out and selling. So it's very fascinating for me to hear business development, but I love what you said, is especially when you said a lot of consulting companies like or accountants or very professional service organizations, they don't like to use the term sales.
Right.
And that is pretty much what was really interesting when I heard about this business development, and then we've had a chance to talk. Now, when you go into business development, you said that you have a team working with you as well, right?
Right.
I'm assuming, you have teams of people working with you. And I guess you have a lot of people who are less than 35 years old.
Yeah.
Yes. So now I specifically want to actually talk to you about this concept of millennials, because I think that's an area that you might have quite some insights about. So when you take a look at millennials, especially in the business development space, right? So what are some of the trends that you're observing with millennials? I've heard a lot of things and rumors about millennials are very hard. They don't like sales as a profession. And there are so many myths out there. So what are some of the things that you're observing in the marketplace out there?
Yeah, so first let me say that in a year's time, I look at thousands of assessments. So probably good to describe what exactly it is that the Devine Group does. We work with companies, organizations, with people analytics and evaluations. And so I'm looking at data on people. And why that's important is because it gives me some objective information. Like you said, there's that narrative out there that millennials, they're entitled, and you know, they're not hard workers, and they expect a lot. So that's the narrative. And what I see is the data. And so I've looked at thousands of millennial assessment results. And so the first thing is, like, what makes them different? Take the narrative aside and say, what is it that I'm seeing and that others are seeing that are hiring millennials? What is it that we're seeing in these assessments and evaluations, these MRIs? And there are a few things that I see that are different. The number one thing that I see that's different is millennials expect a lot from authority. So we have a scale that's called authority relationships. And so I not only employ millennials and help companies that I work with, you know, hire and develop, but also I have 4 millennials.
Yes.
Yes, and so because I really enjoy this whole assessment, because that's what I do, I have assessed not only my children, but their friends, anybody who stands still long enough to take an assessment in my house, and then we talk about the results. And so I was really fascinated by the rise of this scale of authority relationships. And so, and knowing that these kids they're not big on rules and regulations, they're nonconformist, so I'm trying to figure out what this means. And so what I discovered was, it's not that they necessarily like the rules and regulations and that they have a higher respect for authority, it's that they expect a lot from authority. And we'll talk about why in a bit. So that's one thing that I noticed with them. Another thing that I noticed with them is that they like to have a structure in place, and they want to know what is expected of them, and when they don't have clear expectations, it's frustrating for them. And again, you know, I'm speaking globally. And then the third is that they're fairly coachable. They're, you know, they want to be mentored, they want to be coached. And so those are 3 great things. I'm going to throw one other thing in there that I think limits their success, and that is, I'm seeing that this population has a higher need for approval than other populations. And again, that's, you know, all over the spectrum. There are still millennials that have no need for approval, and there are some that are super high. But those are the 4 things that I see that are different.
So actually, let me ask you about point 1 and point 4, which I think is very interesting. Point 1 was they look at authorities and hold them accountable. Does it also, but you also say that they're looking for approval, but approval, what does approval mean? Approval from their supervisors or approval from their peers? You see what I mean? So I can easily see the connection between point 1 where they say, hey, if I look up to you as my supervisor, I also want your approval, for example, or I want to get away from you. That's right. So what does that approval mean? Is it in terms of their supervisors? Is it their peer group, or with their counterparts in their customers' organization? What is it that you find, or is it a little bit of everything?
Well, it can be a little bit of everything. So there are some that have need for approval, but it's only from their supervisor or manager or somebody that they see in a position of authority. That's not really the need for approval that we need to watch out for, especially in sales. The need for approval that we need to watch out for is that high need for approval, that if you think of it as a coffee cup, it's that empty coffee cup that they leave their home with, right? And they have this need for approval, and they're okay with, they just want it filled. And so if it could be filled with somebody, you know, liking posts, I don't know. That wouldn't fill my, but you know, it could be that they go out on a sales call, and this is where it's a problem, that they sit down and they're in the middle of the negotiating part, and the prospect says something to them like, well, you know, this is great information, so glad that you came by, one of the best proposals I think we've ever seen, so I'm going to run this up the flagpole and I'll get back to you, which we know means nothing, right? But they've got that empty need for approval cup, and they're like, wow, best proposal that they ever saw. You know, they're going to get back to me. And so that's where it's trouble.
It's fascinating, because I think then it links back to the fact that if you have the right managers who can coach them, because that's, I think that's a myth that we have, is that these young millennials are not coachable. So of course they have the need for approval, but at the same time, if you have the right managers, they can coach them into making sure that, hey, make sure that if the customer says it's a great proposal, it does not always guarantee a sale.
Right.
Indeed. So essentially, so what I'm hearing from you is that 4 big trends. One is these people expect higher things from their supervisors and they hold them accountable. They are coachable. They want kind of regulated processes and setting the right kind of expectations. But of course, there's this need for approval, which could actually come in the way of them being successful. Am I right in summarizing all this?
Yes, yes. All right. Very good.
Yeah, so that's one of the things which is always good for us to understand, because we have a lot of millennials that we teach in our sales center as well.
Should we talk about why?
Yes.
Why these things have happened?
Absolutely, and I think that would be great for us to have why, and then I want to go into each one of the things that you mentioned. I would really be curious to see when they hold their bosses accountable. I would really like to see how does it manifest in the workplace, if you can share some insights. But of course, why would be great.
Yeah, I think when we look at why, because when it comes right down to it, we have created a difference in this population by the way that we parent them, by the way that we've coached them, by the way that we taught them. And so let's start with the high expectation from authority. And so here's my theory on this. My theory is that when I was growing up, if it was Tuesday afternoon and I had something to tell my dad, who by the way left Sunday night and came back on Saturday morning or Friday night, I had to wait. So that authority figure was not accessible to me the way that if one of my kids, even 5, 6 years ago when they're in high school and now in college, Tuesday afternoon they have something to tell me, they text me. And within moments, unless I'm in a meeting or driving, I'm going to get back to them. And so there is an expectation that when something when they're in need of something, that they're going to have that direct line to authority, and that authority person will get back to them. So I think that's where the expectation, whereas when I started out in the workforce, it was, I got the yellow pages. It was, here's your prospecting list, right? And then I didn't really have a lot of interaction with my boss or manager until the end of the day. So I believe that's where a big part of that comes from, that access to authority. The coachability, kind of the same thing. Our kids come to us because they want to know what we think about something. My parents were not necessarily my first stop. And oftentimes, in fact, I read something where when millennials identify their best friends, who are your best friends, often they will say one of their parents. And I adore my parents, but they're not my best friends, right? And so what do you do with your best friend? You confide with your best friend and you ask your best friend what is their opinion. Now, they have the added bonus of their best friend being 20 years their senior and having much more information. So I think that's where that coachability comes. Not that our kids are going to always listen to what we're saying. I mean, not that they always take our advice, but they're open to it. They're open to hearing it. We still have those children who like to make all the mistakes all by themselves, but they're very coachable. They're coachable like most people are coachable, where, and we'll get into this on what sales and sales leadership should do, but when you coach somebody, you don't tell them what to do. You say things like, you may want to think about this. What have you tried? Have you considered? So that you're throwing, different options at them. I suspect that we're a little bit better. Our generation is a little bit better than our parents were, because our parents were telling us what to do, which is fine, and it's more of a conversation, I think, with how we've raised our millennials.
I think it's very interesting because it all goes back to accessibility, right? The fact is that now they feel that if they text you something, for example, SMS you or text you, and then you respond back, the accessibility is much more there. Because I exactly remember my dad doing the same. He would go in the morning, he would come back in the evening, and then he would be so tired, and it would be very hard for us to get that time of the day, access, and also quality time with them as well. And I think that's one of the things that is happening, because you can actually go back and forth. But at the same time, it also places a huge pressure on sales managers, because now they have to get back to them. And we'll get to that part a little bit later on in terms of what it means in terms of sales leadership. But for me, it's very interesting that these 4 things, 3 positives and 1 which we should be careful about in terms of dealing with it. And what I want to do is actually start picking up on the first one, which is actually the concept of, as a sales manager, if people are looking up to you for advice and stuff like that from a millennials, what would your advice be to a lot of sales managers and sales leadership about dealing with the fact that, hey, you're going to be held accountable? The way I look at it is, sales managers are going to be held more accountable to live by certain standards, which is what, again, in line with the millennial standards. So what would your recommendations be for them?
So 2 other things that we touched on but didn't get to the why, and I'm going to connect that to your question. So one of these things is that they like to have structure and have their expectations be set out. So let's connect that to the sales leader. Number 1 is they have higher expectations for the sales leader, for leadership, period. So as a leader, you have to know what you're doing. It's not enough to have a title. You really have to know what you're doing. One of the areas that this is becoming a problem is with hourly workers and their management. So in the restaurant field or whatever, those hourly workers, whoever it is that they're reporting to, oftentimes they're not that much farther ahead. So let's go back into sales management. What exactly can they do? Look back at the classroom 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. There was much more structure put in place of what the expectations were for the kids going through school. If you walked into a classroom, there was a job chart. Here's the line leader, here's the person in charge of erasers, here's the one that takes the attendance. Everybody had a job. And oftentimes there were star charts that went along with that. Then you look over here and you have the math star chart. Everybody's name, and here's how far they've progressed along. So there's some social, kind
of responsibilities.
Yes, maybe some social. And then you have the reading chart, and here's how far you are in your color. So there's a lot of social accountability. That's what there's a lot of social accountability. There's a lot of structure in here. Then you go home, and on the refrigerator, you have, brush your teeth and do your homework, and the stars. And not every household was like that, but most classrooms were. So even if your parents didn't pull that through to the home, you were used to having your activities in the structure. And then you go into middle school and high school, and you have a project to do, and you have a rubric. I didn't even know what a rubric was until one of my kids brought it up. Here's how I'm being graded. When I was in school, when you were in school, we didn't have any structure necessarily on how we were being graded. Turn in your report, and you're going to get an A, B, or C based on what the teacher thinks you did. So okay, now let's pull that into a salesperson, specifically into sales, and what a sales manager can do is to have very specific activity. Here's what you need to do. And in addition to you need to, knock on so many doors, and you need to make so many cold calls and go to so many networking events and post so many things on social, media, and connect with so many people on LinkedIn. Here's a specific activity that you need to do. So that's because they're used to that. Like, that's how they were taught. And then in addition to that, looking at progress and having that social accountability, because again, who was ahead in the reading, who was ahead in the math. They like that. They like that competition. They're very collaborative. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see somebody who's, not as far ahead on their star chart for reading or math, to have collaboration and have them tap into some of the other people on their sales team. But what sales managers are doing wrong is they don't have the leading indicators. They don't have the activities spelled out. And if they do have, so let's say that they are doing that right, what they're not doing is they're not on a daily, weekly basis going in and inspecting that activity and talking with you about that activity, because that's what they want. That also helps that need for approval, by the way, to, hey, you did a good job here. And so if you have the activity and the leading indicators that you have developed so that you know if you do so many of these, here's your conversion rate because we know this, then that's the type of leadership these kids are looking for.
This is great, because that's pretty much what we try to do even in our sales classes right now. So what we say is that managers should lead by setting activities and setting expectations, because there's too much focus on the lag indicators. And I guess the millennials might be the ones that actually finally would move towards a revamp of the way we sales managers deal with it, because of the fact that there's too much focus on the outcomes and not too much focus on the activities. And I'm thinking that based on what you're saying is that the millennials are going to force a rethink amongst most sales organizations about how they manage the sales force, because that could even help the non-millennials.
Right.
Because there's a movement right now towards evaluating salespeople based on activities rather than just outcomes. So essentially, from what I hear you say, is that if you can do it, not only can you manage your older people, but your millennials might be coachable as well.
Right, right. And in addition to that, where, you know, years ago you enter the workforce and there's a certain amount of time and energy and hours that you are expected to put in there. And, you know, it's not that this population isn't open to doing that, but it's that they're also looking at being, they pride themselves on being more productive than earlier generations. And, you know, I have to say in a lot of aspects they are. Now in sales, you and I both know, you have to work hard and smart. And so sometimes they're setting themselves up for failure because they think, oh, if I can work smarter, it is a profession, you have to work hard. You have to work hard. But the other part of that is, if you're working with an organization, if you're working for an organization, as a millennial or anyone else, and they say, you have to make 800 cold calls a month. That sounds incredible. By the way, I know an organization that is what they expect. And it's not a bad expectation, but what they're doing wrong is they're not saying that, and when you get better, here's what your initial conversion rate from this to, you know, first meeting, from first meeting to second meeting to qualification to closing. And as you get better, your 800 cold calls are going, you know, that's going to go to 600 and to 400. And as your sales coach, I'm going to show you how to do it. So that's not necessarily, you know, we still have a gap there, and that's the working smarter that I think frustrates this generation, because they know it can be done quicker, faster, better.
So Darby, at this point in time, I'm going to kind of conclude the first part of our interview series out here, where the key takeaway so far for me has been is that salespeople, especially millennials, are coachable, but they want clear guidance and expectations. But of course, they also have to make sure that the managers that they look up to are also held accountable. And last but not the least is the need for approval is something that as a sales manager, I should be careful when dealing with millennials. Right. So when we come back, I actually want to dig deeper into the concept of coachability of your salespeople. And I also want to touch upon the need for approval, which I really think is something that management needs to be aware of, especially with their young millennials, because it could lead to a lot of workplace situations which is not very tenable. And of course, we can wrap it up again with some of your key takeaways for managers going forward dealing with millennials. So thank you once again.